Background. I work summers as a camp counsellor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counsellor, Matt, take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sat around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So, the kids are gone to bed. Matt and I are shooting the shit by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decide to head to our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day, and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above the water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counsellor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognised organisation and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman, looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of grey hair that were trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all the wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized that she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly shitting myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine and that she had to leave. "That's good, just as expected for this time," she said, with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, Matt and I, who were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry into the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on the trip. At this point in time, Matt and I were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a fucking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else we could do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counsellor was leading another trip for kids the same age as our group. She sent a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop screwing with us, this isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know that I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss and seen a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline. So, this encounter happened many years ago and I was very young. It was in 2001 or 2002, and I was 11 or 12 at the time. My uncle was interested in purchasing some land near Red Oak, Oklahoma. I don't know exactly where, but it was several acres in a very remote area. My father, mother, and I decided to accompany him one Saturday to scope out the property. From our home, it was a little more than a 3-hour drive, but we all loved riding in the car, so while it was not going to be the most eventful road trip, we all went just to get out of the house. Upon arrival, I remember being very underwhelmed by the place. No houses anywhere near, and hardly even any signs of life at all apart from a few birds, and the wooded area wasn't exactly what I would call picturesque. Still, we parked our car off the road to go explore the woods a little. My uncle was talking about buying the land for hunting, not really my cup of tea. As we walked through the woods, it was a very nice day, but still something felt off. Everyone in our group remarked about the eerie feeling, but my dad and uncle seemed to laugh it off. My mum had goosebumps and kept looking over her shoulder, which made me on edge too. She was very insistent that it was weird and she wanted to leave, saying it felt like she was being watched. After a bit of hiking, I noticed that there was a small red building. I've seen bigger storage sheds in the suburbs, but it looked well built. My uncle said there was nothing about it on the listing, so we went to peek inside. The door was open, and inside there were open cans of food, a ratty blanket on the floor, and it stunk unlike anything I'd ever smelled before. Following this discovery, we all agreed it would be best to just get back in the car, and if it was some crazy hermit living in the woods, we didn't want to be around to find him. Only issue, we had walked pretty far into the woods, and now weren't exactly sure which direction was correct. The eerie feeling really amped up, and we were all on edge. We ended up trekking another mile before we finally found the road, but we were farther down from where we had parked the car, but at least we could just follow the road now. Walking along the road, we came across a truly unsettling sight. Right in the middle of the asphalt was a dark grey cat on fire. I have absolutely no idea why a cat was out in the middle of nowhere, or how it came to be killed and set alight. Obviously, this had just happened, but there was no one in sight. Naturally, we ran the rest of the way to the car. There was a huge scratch in the paint all the way down the side from the hood to the trunk. Thankfully, that was the only damage, and my dad was able to start it without any trouble, and we drove away for as fast as we possibly could. My heart is sped up just recounting this moment, definitely one of the scariest of my life. Needless to say, my uncle did not buy the land. I'll always remember this terrifying encounter, but like anything over time, I just sort of pushed it to the back of my mind, and it just came to be one of those odd moments you occasionally retell at family get-togethers years later. So much that it's almost just a funny story. The reason I'm sharing this is because I was reminded of it last night while binge-watching some episodes of BuzzFeed Unsolved on YouTube, and they shared a story of a family that disappeared in the same area while also looking at some land for sale. The disappearance of the Jamison family is the name of the mystery in the video if you're interested. The family died in the same area we were searching, roughly 7 years after we made our trip there. There are many theories about their deaths, including the allegations of some sort of cult in the area, complete with something about dead cats. Coincidence? Probably, but the whole story gave me chills. So, who knows if my family narrowly avoided being killed by some cult or whatever, or if we just stumbled upon a hermit who didn't want us in his woods. This happened when I was growing up, at around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde in Texas. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease. It was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, it also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfortable, I fucking hated it. All I had to do was either stare out the window or try to beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive, obviously, took most of the day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin in the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in the Scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So, after unlocking the gate, we drove to the cabin on the land and settled in. The cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, and flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out and setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount of time. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was maybe an hour. When we woke up, it was early, about 7 AM. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs, and find a good place to set up our blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they'd been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs and my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away, Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there, not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright coloured red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all, dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. The weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked like ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer, and it was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again, no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnap the clip on his pistol holder. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down and watched him circle around the man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" He called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it and my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird shit, or signs of being outside for more than a day. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him getting worried. Almost immediately after I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality it was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the lease possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling, but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week, he got a call from his buddy, and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that's happened to me in the woods, but definitely top 3. So, whoever was out there, I'm glad we never met. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place, but I've held on to this story for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy, and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, and came back and had dinner. It was all very normal, until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and our stereo that we bought back in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest to the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces laying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet, and not the beautiful campsite we had saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before, and that an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it, and and went to the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home, and told me that he had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it to anyone either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. This story takes place in North Italy back in 2014. It was early September. A friend of mine suggested we take a short hike in the woods near his town. I obviously agreed, since I love hiking and nature. We prepared our backpacks, grabbed some food, and drove to the place. My friend knew the area very well, so we didn't take a map. We didn't have flashlights either, since we planned to return to the car in a few hours, and in early September, daylight lasts for pretty long. As we went deeper into the woods, we saw beautiful spots, small rivers, and a pair of caves that we explored. They were pretty small and only had one big chamber. We had lunch and proceeded to follow a trail in a deeply wooded area. After a bit more than half an hour, we arrived behind a pretty large clearance in the trees. And here comes the weird part. In that clearance, there was a bunch of people, around 4 or 5, dressed normally. They were simply talking and laughing, no satanic cults, dreadful chants, praying in circles, etc. Just super ordinary people like me and my friend talking to each other. They obviously saw us too, since the clearing had no trees or rocks to cover the view, and we couldn't avoid that, since the trail, after a deep curve, immediately cuts into the clearing. We said while approaching them, "Hey there, what's up?" They didn't answer back, and started to stare at us without saying a single word. This obviously launched a huge red flag. We stopped too, and I looked at my mate. He looked back at me, obviously concerned as well. We again said, "Hey." No answers. I started to feel uneasy, so we decided to turn back to the car. But soon after we turned to go back, we realized they started to follow us. As we noticed it, we yelled, "Why are you following us? Did we do something wrong?" Yeah, we were still pretty young and dumb. No answer. Of course, we then proceeded to walk faster and tried to get off the trail. Another pretty dumb choice, but again, my friend knew the area well. But they were always about 15 meters behind us. We started to panic, looked at each other and agreed to make a run for it. As soon as we began running, we heard them start chasing after us. This made us freak out, and we did our best to put more distance between us and them. Another thing that made me panic was the fact that we were, as I said, around 40 minutes away from the car at that point, and we were in a very isolated area, so I didn't like our chances. At some point, when we were about halfway back, we noticed that they weren't behind us anymore. We thought that maybe we managed to make them lose track of us. Like I said, the area was heavily wooded and has plenty of slopes, so it's easy to get lost if you're not used to it. We hid behind a thick bush and tried to listen. Silence, no footsteps, nor voices. And keep in mind that, even when they were following us, they didn't say a single word. So we breathed a sigh of relief and managed to return to the car, trying our best to be as silent as possible. We jumped in the car and raced the fuck out of there, but it doesn't end here. As we left the woods, we saw another car slip out from a side road and start following us. We then realised that they probably never lost sight of us. We are sure that they were the same people since 1, they were basically tailgating us, 2, the area is rarely visited and there weren't any other cars in the car park other than my friend's, and 3, their car had no plates. We drove back to my friend's town, purposefully not back to his house. Taking all the back roads, and every turn we made, they did as well. As we reached the town, they made a U-turn and went back in the direction of the woods. We were fucking terrified, and we immediately called the police. We also informed the people that were in the small town square as they approached us, since me and my friend were basically crying as we got out of the car, to check the area out, but no evidence of activity came up in the following hours. They never ever showed up anymore in the following days, but we were too paranoid for weeks to even leave our houses. It was a Sunday, early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog. Her name's Molly. She's a mutt, but she's not a tiny dog by any means. At that time, I felt very safe around her and would often take her for walks in the forest that's nearby. The day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I immediately got out of the car and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her, since I'd smell like her for the rest of the day. I put her leash on and asked my dad if I could take her out for a walk. He always thought that we would just go down the road and back, but I always found it more interesting to take her into the forest. I always felt a certain kind of peace and relaxation there. It was unmatched by anything else. So, we took a turn and headed to the forest. Usually when we got there, I'd take her leash off, so she could explore on her own. Most of the time I'd carve my name into the trees or look for anything interesting. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, presumably from an old table, and that's when I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't usual when we were in the forest. I thought it was a fox or some other animal, so I quickly grabbed the wooden leg like a weapon. I knew that if it was a fox I wouldn't attack it, but I had a sense of security while I was holding it. I called out, "Molly, Molly," but she just kept barking. This was very strange for me, since she always came to me when I called. I followed the sound of her barks and stumbled across a scene that I'll never forget. There was a man, probably in his late 50s, half naked, carrying a large machete in one hand and holding moonshine in the other. This was the first time that I stumbled across someone in the woods, let alone someone half naked and carrying a big-ass machete. He was completely ignoring Molly and hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Even now I have no idea how I would handle it. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked in confusion. I don't think I understood the seriousness of the situation at the time. He turned around, revealing his face. He had some of the clearest blue eyes that I had ever seen to this day. I could see them so well because they were open wide. "Come here, boy. Look what I've dug up." I was afraid that if I didn't listen to him, he would start chasing after me, and that was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got closer but kept a good distance. I didn't see anything, except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle. I used this window of time to get my dog, and started walking away slowly, so as not to notify him that I was leaving. Then I took one final glance at the man. His head was dug deep in the hole. I was intrigued, so I kept looking. I know, how stupid. He finally got up from the ground. I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea what animal it belonged to, if it even did belong to an animal. I had seen enough and started sprinting with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and then I saw something flying from the corner of my eye. It was a damn machete. I heard him yell, "Damn it!" This made me run even faster. I know the forest very well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I ripped through the branches and bushes until I got out of that forest, but I didn't stop sprinting till I arrived at the garage, where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. I didn't tell him a single thing about the man, since I was afraid he'd get angry and wouldn't allow me to walk Molly anymore. I never went to that forest alone ever again. So, the man with the machete and the bone in his mouth, let's not meet. My childhood best friend, Marie, and I were around 11 or 12 years old at the time. Marie's family had their own campsite in a provincial park about 2 hours from our hometown, and would spend the entire summer each year living in their camper out there. This particular summer, I was able to go and stay with them for a week, and we were excited to spend our time adventuring around the forest. On the last night that I was there, we decided we wanted to hurry down to the ice cream shop by the lake before it closed. It was early evening at this point, but still pretty bright out, but beginning to lose light. The path we took was down a short slope right next to the main road, with maybe 10 feet of thick brush and trees in between. On the other side was the forest, with more tall, thick brush. So we were walking along, not seeing a single other person on the path in front or behind us. We hear a sudden rustling and snapping of branches, similar to the sound of maybe a deer moving through the woods. I wouldn't have thought anything about it, but then, the sound of running footsteps follows. Marie glances back, and suddenly grabs my arm, urging me under her breath not to look back. At the same time, the running stops. I don't know why I didn't ignore her and get a look myself. I guess I could sense the very real fear in her voice and chose to listen. We both start to panic, getting that feeling like when you're running up the stairs after turning the basement light off. We pick up speed as much as we can without breaking into a sprint, knowing the ice cream shop is only about a minute walk away at this point. The path soon breaks, and we're in the parking lot. Suddenly, Marie steers me hard to the left, heading towards the lake and the boat rental instead of continuing straight to the ice cream shop. And I go along with it silently, understanding ice cream is no longer an interest right now. Marie is clearly panicking at this point. We are both looking around, but it seems whatever scared her is nowhere in sight at this point. Marie walks up to the boat rental and gets us a kayak, climb in, and begin to paddle out into the middle of the lake. As we paddle, she tells me there was a man behind us, and the man had stopped running at us very abruptly upon making eye contact with her. He had been wearing a long black coat with the hood up, despite it being the middle of July, and had a terrible smirk on his face. She swore that as he stopped running, she saw him putting something shining away into his coat. He appeared to have just emerged out of the bushes after we walked past, given the sounds we heard right before he came running onto the path. We reached the centre of the lake and stopped paddling. I pull out my Nokia brick phone that my parents, thank God, had given me just in case. I hand it to Marie and tell her to call her parents to come pick us up. As the phone rings, I see her look out past me to the shore and go pale. Lifting a hand to point to what she's seeing, I turn, and there was a man, stalking his way around the path that circled the edge of the lake, staring out at us. We sat in the middle of the lake and watched him do 2 full laps, never looking away from us, before finally disappearing. It took a few tries to get a hold of her family, who were freaking out so bad the whole time, as the sun got lower and lower. We did manage to have someone come with the truck, but by the time we reached the shore it was pretty dark outside. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't been able to call for a ride. Looking back, I don't know why we didn't just go to the ice cream shop, inform an adult there, and ask her parents to come and get us then. But it worked out, we got back safe, and we thankfully never saw the man again. Growing up in the Appalachian Mountains, I could give you a million times as a kid and young adult I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not really, out there by myself or with my friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older, because of the forts and carvings we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came along to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and got a fire going. The plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed, play some Monopoly. For sake of backstory, my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, really goofy guy who comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants he came across. He had no fear of going camping out by himself. If I had spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone, because I could never shake the feeling of being watched. Which was just paranoia, but still an uneasy feeling. Anyways, camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs some wood. Sun is down and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on his little chair he always brought and loading up his makeshift bong, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off some logs that we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. Across from us, on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running, and would slow to a walk and then run again. Definitely on 2 legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped, with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound that it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still, and I knew that I was staring right at them in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy," and when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him. I'd been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend, after a while, grab some leaves, and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire, we were in pure darkness. Then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off the spot, or moved much for over an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched, and they slowly walked off. Whoever they were, they had sat crouched, watching us, without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realised the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went into the tent, and I had a very short, light sleep sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, we talk about it. In the 7 or 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself. I grew up just north of New York City. Living in a pretty densely populated metropolitan area, I always looked forward to summer, when my father and I went backpacking upstate. We had a spot about an hour north of Lake George, in the Adirondacks, and camped a few nights every summer. One trip, a few years back now, we were driving to the trailhead. On a long, narrow dirt road, we saw a car pulled over with a few people arguing outside the car. This isn't the most secluded spot in the world, so it's not uncommon to see another family. But it was weird that a car would be pulled over here, with no real access to any trails. As we drove closer, a man walked over and waved at us. We assumed they were having car trouble. My father rolled down his window. Suddenly a female in the group screamed, "Get away from him!" The man suddenly had a serious face and began sprinting towards us. He was tall and well built, and moving quickly. My father slammed on his brakes and quickly pulled the car into reverse. The man stopped and let out a sigh. We just sat there, parked, confused. The man reached towards us. We were a good 10 or so yards away. Then he darted off the road and into the woods. Cautiously, at this point, we drove slowly towards the parked car. There were 3 women, crying. They were his sisters, and apparently he had just returned home from the army a few months prior. According to the women, shortly after he got back, he began acting odd and was diagnosed with PTSD, as well as early onset Alzheimer's disease. The women got back in their car and headed for town. They said that they were going to the ranger station to get help locating him. The rest of the day was fairly uneventful. We hiked to our campsite, fished for a bit, and set up camp for the night. Sitting next to the fire, my father and I felt some strange vibes. We weren't sure whether the women were telling the truth, or if the man was trying to ask us for our help. What was more disturbing was the fact that we were camping only a few miles away from where this man ran off. We weren't sure if he was violent, armed, or if he had followed us. Typically, my father and I sleep in separate bivvy tents, but we decided to stay in the shelter that night. It was basically a small log cabin with 3 walls and an open front, where the fire pit was located. Neither of us slept too much that night. It's probably just my imagination, but I swear I felt I was being watched, though my father and I didn't hear footsteps or anything out of the ordinary. The next morning, I left camp to take a leak. A few hundred feet away from our camp, I saw a small fire pit right on the trail. I placed my hands on the ashes. They were soaked. Someone had a fire here and very recently poured water on it. We had food and supplies for 4 nights, but after I found that fire pit, we broke camp and left that morning. So, to that strange man, let's not meet. So, to begin, this event took place in summer of 2019 in England, or more specifically the Midlands. At the time of this story, I was 15, male, and I was also with 3 friends, all 15, also male. Me and my 3 friends, who I will call James, Brad, and Ryan for the purpose of this story, were bored with nothing to do. Most of our friends had long gone inside, and the time was probably around 6 or 7 p.m. We were near a small stretch of woods that was near a road that had a nice path to walk through it along with the stream. After walking and conversing for maybe 10 minutes, we stopped at a bench to rest and just play some music and enjoy the last of the heat as the night began to draw in. Not like dark, but just around the time before sunset, when the sky gets a nice orange hue. After sitting and chatting for maybe 15 minutes, with no sign of anyone else on the short trail, an old couple came up walking past us. The woman had a long skirt on, down to her shoes, and one of those old women's hats from like the 40s. I can't remember anything distinctive about her face, except that she seemed maybe 60 or 70 at most, very grey and dull in looks. The man seemed slightly older than the woman, and had a cream shirt on, old jeans, work boots, and a cane in one hand. They had their arms interlocked, and seemed almost ordinary, apart from the clothing and such, which seemed quite dated. We were sat on a small bench that could fit 3 people maximum on it. Therefore me, Ryan and Brad sat on the bench while James, on the opposite side of the path, sat on the floor facing us. Now just to point out something which becomes somewhat important soon, Brad is of Indian descent while the rest of us were white British. As the couple were to pass through us, James had to bring his legs in to let them pass. However, the man seemed somewhat mad about this and almost scoffed as he walked past James. Understandably, James was a little confused and offended by this, and in a half-assertive, half-joking way said, "Alright mate, no need for that." The couple seemed to ignore it and carried on down the hill. Now this is where things get creepy. We brushed this off as an old man grumpy at the world, trying to seem like a hero to his wife, and expected them to just move along, but this didn't happen. As they reached the bottom of the hill, his head made an almost full 90-degree turn to face us, and with the most menacing look on his face, he charged up the hill. Now the strangest part is a full 60 seconds had at least passed, and now he was pissed? Made no sense. Like, all of a sudden my friend's slight remark had clicked in his brain. He also dropped his cane, much to his wife's despair, and walked almost double his previous speed uphill. We were truly baffled, and maybe expected a stern talking to, and to an extent, that's what we got from him. At least the usual old man stuff, you kids have no respect, and you should watch out, you don't know us, I have grandkids your age, etc. And it was as quickly as he said all of this, he walked back down the hill, retrieved his cane, and began staring at us from the bottom of the hill, alongside his wife. This is where things took a drastic turn. The man then stood there, almost huffing and puffing like an angry toddler. His wife saw this as her turn to make the approach, as he stood, for the whole time after this by the way, staring at us, not blinking, barely moving. His wife made her way back up the hill and began speaking to us. She seemed even more delusional and even incoherent in the way she acted and spoke. Most of the stuff she said was the same as her husband, until she took a huge interest in Brad. Remember how I said he was of Indian descent? She looked him dead in the eyes and said, "You're different to all of these, aren't you?" with an almost half grin on her face. Brad was taken aback and said, "Sorry? Is that a racist?" She shot back instantly with a, "Oh no, I just mean you're different. You're the chosen one." I know, weird, and almost cliche sounding, right? At this we were all shocked, and began shooting each other concerned and confused half glances. Then she began waving to the trees behind the bench where we were sitting, her eyes frantically darting from point to point, and waving almost methodically in motion as she exclaimed loudly, and almost proudly, "It's okay. You don't need to watch them anymore. It's fine. You don't need to come out now. You can stay there." At this we all turned around rapidly to see no one or nothing behind us. And at that, she shot Brad one more deep stare and started her walk again. The old man stared the whole time until they met at the bottom of the hill, interlocked arms, and turned the corner. We were all feeling all types of emotions now, and really didn't know what to do. The woods on either side of our path were thick. So thick, in fact, even teens couldn't enter it, let alone old-age pensioners, so there's only one place they could have gone, which was follow the path on. Ryan had the smart idea to see where they went, so no less than 20 seconds after they rounded the corner, we followed them at an almost running walk speed, and got to the end of the trail, with no sign of them. The end of the trail led to 3 directions: left, into an alley and a shop with a dead end; right, into the start of a busy road with nothing to see; and straight into a cul-de-sac. Brad and I went straight, Ryan went left, James went right, but you guessed it, they were gone. How? We met up in disbelief, shock and confusion, and everything in between. The sun was now pulling in, and we needed to make our way home. Therefore, that's what we did. The way home was at least a 20 to 30 minute walk, half paranoid we would see them again, but not really flustered. It's now been like half a year, and we'd all forgotten about these people and never seen them again. But after reading some stories and hearing them on YouTube, it reminded me of that evening, and I thought you guys would like to hear it. Growing up, every summer in July or August, my family would get together and camp out for 2 weeks at White Lake State Park in Tamworth, New Hampshire. Some of my best childhood memories were made there. Rollerblading, Nerf gun wars, flashlight tag, and water balloon fights with my cousins and neighbouring kids in the campground. When I was around my late teen years, my family stopped gathering to the camp out after my grandmother passed away. One of the last years I was there, this one memory has stuck with me. A little over 10 years ago, I was 16 years old. It was around 10 PM at night when I noticed I had missed a call on my cheap little track phone. My family was sitting around the campfire cooking s'mores and sharing some laughs, so I decided to go off for some privacy to return the call. I took a long narrow trail that winds in between other campsites that at the end leads up to the bathroom. I wasn't going up to the bathroom, I just wanted to find an empty campsite and sit at a picnic table to make my call. There were plenty of those, since this whole side of the campground where I was heading was vacant. There were no other campers nearby in that area. It was quiet and dark. So, I chose a campsite, sat down at the table. The lights from the distant bathroom from up on top of the hill behind me were illuminating my surroundings just a little bit. I called my friend and carried on a conversation for about 20 minutes. As I'm sitting there, staring straight ahead, I see a silhouette coming down the road in front of me. The figure is coming towards my direction, where all these empty campsites are. I could see it was a person. It's not that unusual to see people strolling through the campground for a night walk. People I see usually have flashlights though. This person did not. I wasn't creeped out at this point, no reason to be. I was just watching, curiously. As the person got closer, I could see a better outline, and that it was a man I was looking at. I also noticed his pace slowed down. I kept my eyes fixated on him as I continued conversing on my cell phone. A minute or two passes, and now he stopped moving. He's just standing there in the road looking straight into the campsite where I'm at. I don't know if he knew I could see him. He was staring at me, and I was staring right back at him. He was a little heavy set and tall. I could also make out that he was wearing a light jacket. I couldn't see much for facial features, but I would guess I was staring at a man in his 30s or 40s. Alarm bells were going off in my head now. My mind had turned to mush at this point. I'm frozen. I was no longer listening to what my friend was saying on the phone. I was in a stare-off with this guy. Then, he started to move again. He was tiptoeing towards me, very carefully, like he didn't want to make noise. He put one foot in front of the other, leaning forward in a slight hunch form. He looked like he was about to charge towards me. In that moment, I snapped out of my mind-mushy frozen state and leaped off the picnic table and started running through the campsite back towards the trail. I could hear him trampling behind me, leaves scuffling, heavy yet fast footsteps. Footsteps that were getting louder and closer. I made it back to that narrow trail. Once he got close to whereabouts I was, I heard the sound of twigs snapping and oof noise that came from the man, which I can imagine maybe he tripped, or almost tripped, or maybe got face slapped by a tree branch. Most likely, he wasn't familiar with the trail like I was. Whatever the reason was, it caused him to stop chasing after me. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running until it made it back to my family's campsite. When I got back, they were still sharing laughs and smiles by the campfire. I broke down crying and I was trembling. I explained what had just happened. My aunt spoke up and said, geez, he probably thought he knew you and was coming up to give you a good scare as a joke." She dismissed me. My cousin chimed in and said, "Yeah, he probably stopped running after he realised that he didn't actually know you. Probably feels dumb now." They all chuckle about it and change the subject. I think I was dismissed because no one wanted the good vibes of the night to be ruined, and the fact that I'm just a socially anxious person in general. I'm very cautious and shy. For that time being, I let them convince me I was just overreacting and overthinking. But here I am years later, looking back and shaking my head over this. I wish I was taken more seriously, but other than that one thing happening, it was still a great trip. It was time well spent with family. My experience makes me think twice about going for a walk by myself anywhere. I carry pepper spray and a mini keychain alarm on me now. So, Mr. Campground Chaser, let's not meet again. Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in some nature reserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the name. It was a pretty primitive camping. No cell service, and we saw 2 other people there in the entire place. It was huge, so it was pretty empty. My boyfriend pretty much immediately said these 2 people seemed off to him right away. I don't know if they had anything to do with what happened that night, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked off the trail and hood open. I don't really notice these types of things, but my boyfriend said it looked to him like she was waiting for someone to pull off beside her and offer to help with her truck. Normally, my boyfriend is the type to at least offer to call someone. but he said she skeeved him out enough he didn't even want to draw her attention more than what's necessary. The next person we saw drove by several times while we were setting up. He just kept driving by slowly and looking at us. I didn't even notice though until my boyfriend pointed out that he'd already done it twice. Whether these two people had anything sinister going on or not, the real story has to do with what woke us around 3 a.m. It was incredibly loud and sudden. I couldn't describe it or even compare it to anything, but my boyfriend said it sounded to him similar to a chain gun revving up, or someone using some large tool to scrape gravel. My boyfriend jumped up and looked out the little window of the tent. The sound happened again, and again, and it was getting noticeably closer each time. I was about to piss myself, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles off. I didn't question this because loud noises can be heard from miles off, right? Well, later my boyfriend told me that because he didn't want to scare me. It really sounded like it was coming from right down the little dirt road. At one point he said he suspected it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to get out and dart for the car was because he was afraid it could be someone trying to scare us out of the tent for some dreadful reason. He whispered. I should have noticed he was whispering and knew something was wrong, since otherwise he'd just speak normally, right? For me to just go back to sleep. However, I could not, because every little sound I heard outside sounded like someone sneaking up to the tent. Eventually, my boyfriend told me to get out and help him pack up. It was maybe 20 minutes after the sound stopped. He held our only weapon, a machete, in front of him. It was a full moon or close to it, so he didn't need a light. While we were packing quickly, I noticed an empty beer can close to our dead campfire. It wasn't there when we went to sleep at around 10 p.m, and neither of us even brought any beer. Thankfully we got out of there, and for the rest of the trip, we either camped in areas well populated by other campers, or we got a hotel room. So, whoever or whatever that was, let's never meet. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers, and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area was at a Walmart, fast food joint, or a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no mobile service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging around those trailheads, or just driving around the Forest Service roads. These are rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for 4x4s. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the National Forest. Probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep on looking, so we drive for about another hour further into the woods. By this time, it's already getting a bit dark, and we're getting worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the forest rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like four-wheel drive vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to just go over it. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed pretty odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and we set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I see a green bottle lying on the ground. I take a look at the label and saw that it was a bottle of Home and Garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time and I just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from our nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 PM. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was the moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles just didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know, I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomach, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to go take a look. My other friend, Isaac, decides to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would go around all the trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. We're almost to the top of the hill. Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit." A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We look at each other and decide that maybe we don't need to see what that light was after all. We walk back in silence and keep looking back every few seconds. We decide to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to camp. When we get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the camp. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the campsite and was peering into the tent. When we were almost back to camp, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we saw him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. As we ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with a paintball gun, he gets a strange look on his face. "They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it?" We go and check the truck. Enter the door code and see all our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck was still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I asked. "I was watching a movie on my phone and I fell asleep, I guess." "But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets?" Isaac said he'd been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us were way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent, we just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump in the F-150 and I start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, all of us have sobered up to the situation. No one wants to get out of the car and try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drive forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It must have just been balanced on top, and we drive over it slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as it drove over it, but it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the service road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It stays just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding on gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again though. So, this one might be a bit long. but I need to go into it slowly, so bear with me. Me and my boyfriend love to camp. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to go to the coast because we had a Friday off from our classes at uni, and decided to hike and camp out for the weekend. We had a 3-day plan, to stay in 3 different towns and hike to each place. This story is about the first place we stayed in. The first town was barely a town. It was more like a bunch of small houses, farmlands, and very few people. It was off-season, so normally there would be some tourists there, since the main attraction is a huge, abandoned city left over from the times of ancient Greek civilization. Anyway, since there were 5 to 6 campsites available, one of which was highly recommended on TripAdvisor and the likes of, we didn't bother calling beforehand. We simply headed there and then straight to that camping area. Upon reaching it, we saw the gate open. Not really so unusual, but when we entered into it, no one seemed to be there. We knocked and called out for someone, but no one responded, except the outdoor bar was all open with expensive bottles of alcohol lined up and food left on the kitchen table, as we saw from the window, so they couldn't have gone far. My boyfriend found it a bit strange they would leave everything open like that, but assuming it was a small community with no crime, we didn't think any more of it. We went to some other camping grounds to ask if they were open. The first one we went to said they were closed because their grounds were very messy these days, but they recommended us another place. We asked them about the first ground we had went to, and strangely, the man said, "Don't go there." When we asked why, he said, I don't really recommend you go there." Anyway, the other place he told us about was also closed, but luckily in the meantime, I found a signboard for the first place, and it had their number on it. We called them, and a man picked up and told us that he and his wife, who run the place, are out for a couple of hours but will be back by evening. He said we could set up our camp and that we would meet later. The place was a bit secluded, but it was quite picturesque, so we set up our camp and left. We spent the whole day exploring and hiking around, and after a tiring day, around 10 PM after dinner, we started heading back. This is when things got extra creepy. When we got back, we found the place still empty. No one had returned and it was quite late. My boyfriend called up the owners again and said that they had decided not to return tonight, but that we could leave the money under the table mat by the bar. They said the kitchen and bathrooms are open if we needed to use them. The place was dark and the yard where we had set up camp was huge without any lighting. My boyfriend immediately started to feel a bit uneasy. He was concerned why 2 business owners would leave their property completely open to 2 total strangers with a bar full of unopened bottles and a half-open house. As we walked towards our camp, he kept subtly expressing his uneasiness and kept looking around. He's usually pretty calm, so I told him if he's really feeling so strongly about this, we can just go to the pension where we'd had dinner earlier and stay the night there in a hotel room. He opened the flashlight of his phone and kept looking around, getting more and more uneasy. We agreed to pack up our camp and leave. I began to pack it up since it requires a lot of folding and he was already anxious. I told him just to stand there and give me light as I packed it up. Except constantly he would move the light and check the area, and I kept getting irritated because I could sense his worry at the time and couldn't pack fast enough because I couldn't see. At one point, he even told me in a slightly bitchy way to hurry it up, and as soon as I folded the camp, we stuffed it into its bag and hurriedly packed our shit and scooted. He still seemed super anxious, and I told him to relax. Just telling this part gives me the chills all over again. The road back to the main area of the town was dark and lonely, and this is when he told me, "There's something I want to say, but not while we were still on the grounds." "Well, what is it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said he didn't want to freak me out, but he was sure that he saw someone lurking in the dark behind the wooden cabins and by the bathrooms. Twice. No one was supposed to be there except us. I got the chills, but I still tried to rationalize, saying it's a farm area, there's lots of animals. Maybe a cat moving around. But he was adamant it was a human figure, walking like a human would, and standing. That's why he kept checking and wanted to hurry so much. And that's why he was telling me to hush up and keep my voice down. I almost had tears in my eyes at this point, and the hair on my back was standing. I kept looking back and almost running at this point to the lighted area of the quiet town, and only really relaxed till we reached the pension and booked a room there, got the key, locked and checked it twice. I'm generally a skeptical person, but I really do believe my boyfriend didn't just see things. I don't know who that was back there or what could have happened, if anything. I don't care to know. Dark and isolated places have always creeped me out anyway. Person lurking in the dark, let's never ever meet.